Everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm going to try and make this intro as quick as I can, which is to say that this week we are editing 3 images that actually were taken for last week's video. If you've seen last week's video, then you know we made a road trip about 3 hours south to Falls Creek Falls at the Oregon-Washington border. But having watched that video, what you might not know is that those images don't exist yet. I actually have not edited any of those images to make the final images that you saw in that video. That is what you and I are doing today. So I have 3 photos that I've picked out from that day that look like they have some potential and that also kind of highlight some unique problems you might encounter when taking landscape photos. And it's those photos that we're going to edit together. Before we get started, I have 2 things that I want to highlight. The first is a bit of a request. I am asking you to put down in the comments section your feedback, how you would edit these photos differently, if you agree or disagree with how I'm doing things, or if you just have some thoughts. I want this to be a conversation because in the future, these videos hopefully will actually be done as live sessions where we can, as a community, collaboratively edit an image and have an open conversation about what we would or maybe wouldn't do differently in that situation. Second, I want to highlight, this is a bit of a touchy subject, my editing philosophy. Everyone has guardrails, their own personal limits of what they are or are not willing to do to make a good photo. And personally for me, just to set some expectations here, in this video and in future videos, you will never see me doing things like sky replacements, adding star trails where there were no star trails, adding in wildlife or people that were not in a photo, or just generally doing any kind of heavy doctoring or editing or even heavy compositing of images. That's just my own personal take, and it really is because I'm doing this. I'm going out and taking these photos for memories. I want to look at a photo that I took, for example, in Hawaii, and to bring myself back to that moment of standing on the rim of a volcano and feeling hot cinders landing on my shoulders. And if I add elements into that photo that weren't there, that aren't part of my memory, it just doesn't serve the purpose of that photo and why I took it in the first place. So I'm not yucking on anyone's yum. You know, if you have a different, more heavier editing style, that's totally fine. More power to you. Just setting expectations for what you should expect to see here. But I have our very first photo queued up, and I think we should get to it. For our first edit, we have this image right here of Falls Creek moving its way through the understory as you hike up to Falls Creek Falls. And there are 3 things that I want to highlight about this photo right now and that we want to keep in mind when we edit this image. The first are these rocks in the foreground with that nice moss on them. The second is the water and the movement that it gives the image with a 0.8 second exposure. Not terribly long, just enough to get some movement going. And then third, really the subject of the image is this vine maple tree that is on the opposite shoreline and just the way that the light is hitting its leaves and really making them pop. So what we're going for in this image is a little bit more of a moody look. We want those leaves to pop. We want the entire scene to be vibrant and green, but we don't want it to be over the top. So the very first thing that I'm going to do, and I'm going to move pretty quick here, is to adjust my exposure. Looks like around 0.4, about half a stop underexposed, which is fine. That's how I usually do any sort of long exposure of water. I'm going to drag down my highlights because I am a little concerned about these especially bright areas right here. Those tend to get overexposed when you're doing long exposures of water. We're going to increase our shadows, and that's going to give us a little bit more detail on these foreground rocks. Our whites, I'm going to leave as is. And for now, our blacks, I think we'll actually maybe decrease to make like a -10 or something. Pretty middle of the road, nothing too crazy. I'm going to leave the dehaze, the texture, the clarity alone for now. And I will increase the vibrance just a little bit, maybe like a +10. And oftentimes when I do that, to not let it overpower an image, I actually like to desaturate a little bit, maybe just like a -4 or something like that. I don't want, you know, lime green greens or anything like that. I'm going to go through and we're going to add a little bit to our lights. And what I'm looking for as I do this is just the overall mood of the image. You can see as I drag the darks down, really these leaves, they're starting to pop. The rest of the image is getting a little bit darker. And our shadows, I'm actually going to keep increasing a little bit. I want to retain the detail that we have in those foreground elements. And we'll kind of selectively brush some areas of this image to be a bit darker in just a minute. Scrolling down On this image at the moment, I'm not really going to do very much color grading. You can color grade by hand, and I do that every now and then. What I really like to do instead is I actually have some VSCO film presets. I love the way that some film like Kodak Gold 100 or 200 looks, and I find these really useful for inspiration and to kind of fast track the actual edit of the image itself, but I don't necessarily use them on every image. It's just about inspiration, about colors that I want in that image. Working our way down on the right-hand side, we're going to save the denoising on this image for now. We're not going to do any raw details or super resolution. This image doesn't need it. It was taken in ISO 50 with a 30 megapixel camera, so we're fine in terms of detail. The lens profiles are already applied, which is great because this is an ultra-wide lens, so we do need to be cautious around distortion. And here, because I want this image to be dark and moody, we are actually going to add a little bit of a vignette, maybe about a -15. What I'm looking for in the image is for these areas over here, our corners where the vignette is being applied, I don't want those to be brighter than the vine maple that I'm trying to highlight in this photo. So as a whole, that looks good. Looks like a good starting place. We're certainly not done. Now is when I usually go into my brushing of an image. With a portrait, it would be subject, but for today, we're actually just going to do some brushing and some kind of luminance ranging, stuff like that. The first thing that I want is I want these rocks with the green moss on them to be a lot more apparent to the viewer. So we're going to go through, I'm going to turn on auto masking, and I'm going to turn off auto masking. I'll show you why in just a second. And we are going to just paint over these rocks. Right now I have my flows set to basically 100%, 99. You can reduce that a little bit if you want a softer touch, but I find generally that I like to keep it pretty high, and then I like to go in and more erase a brush after the fact. You can see right now that we have really coarse edges around some of these brushed areas. We're bleeding into the water, and that is not something that you want, but I will show you in just a second how to clean that up. So I'm going to go through and I'm just going to brush this log over on the right-hand side. I'm not going to go too crazy on these other rocks that are a little bit more in the background. I want our foreground to have all this extra detail. So just like that. There you go. I'm being real messy right now, and that is on purpose. You're about to see why. Okay, that looks pretty good. I have auto mask turned off when I do this brush because I find actually it can be a little bit too selective in Lightroom. Instead, we're going to go to erase, and we're going to erase with a mask. And by clicking on the water over here and by reducing the size of my brush, I can really quickly kind of bring it back to just the areas where I want it to be. You'll notice I have the flow over here turned down just a tad, and that's because I don't want really, really harsh borders between areas that I've brushed and areas that I haven't brushed. So just going around, cleaning up the edges around these rocks. Shouldn't take me very long at all. You can see that we've got some red right there, clean the red out right here. If you're wondering about where this red is coming from, you turn it on and off to show the overlay right here of the brush. We'll just finish cleaning up around this rock right here. You'll notice these other rocks right here are already plenty bright. They have plenty of detail. We don't need to treat those rocks at all. There we go. And actually, I'm going to decrease the flow of my eraser right here, turn off auto masking, and just blend this area a little bit more gently right here where it meets the water. Okay, that looks pretty good. We've got a good solid mask around these foreground rocks. Clean it up a little bit there. We're going to turn off the overlay, and then we're going to come down here and treat these rocks by adjusting their exposure. Let's increase them maybe about 1/3 of a stop or so. We're going to crank our shadows up just a tad. And a little bit of a tip here, anytime you increase shadows, a general suggestion that I would have for you is to, not as much, but just a tad, bring your blacks down. And that's going to add contrast to those areas that you increased your shadows in. The net effect is still increasing the exposure of those areas, but it's going to make it look a little bit more realistic and keep the detail nice and crisp. And we're actually going to increase our whites just a tad. That's really going to be more working on these brighter areas of these rocks right here. I mentioned before that I don't normally do dehaze or clarity on the whole image, but I do use it when we're doing small brushed areas like this. If you crank the dehaze, you're going to see that things get darker. If you bring it back, you're going to see things get lighter. So what I'm going to do is bring it back maybe -2 or -5, increase our clarity just a tad, and increase our texture. We want these fuzzy, mossy rocks to look just like how they did in real life. And that actually looks pretty good in terms of the rocks. Maybe we could get a little bit brighter, but that's more on these rocks right here, and over here I'm quite happy. I don't want bright elements over on the right-hand side over here. So we're just gonna do a quick second brush. Again, auto mask is turned off. We're just gonna hit these rocks right here and this guy real quick. Auto mask is turned on for the eraser. You might have a different way of doing this. This is just the way that I have found that I like to do it. That looks pretty good. And we're just going to increase the exposure on these guys just a tad. There we go. So now the exposure of these rocks is a bit more even with this rock right here. Drop our contrast, or increase our contrast just a tad. And again, if you increase the shadows, bring your blacks down just a tad. That looks pretty darn good. I'm happy with that. Now, what I actually really like about this image, and this was just natural light, is how dark the left-hand side of the image is. And I would like this right-hand side to also be pretty dark, so that way the bright water carries you through the image to the vine maple. Right now, it kind of carries you through the image, and then you just pass by the vine maple on your way down the stream. We don't want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here, and we're probably just going to pick a linear gradient, to be honest with you. Really cut and dry and simple. I'm going to make it pretty gradual by expanding the linear gradient like that. You can see that if it's short, it's a much sharper, much more abrupt transition. But if I increase it like that, there we go. That's nice and gentle. And if we want, if we need to, we can always remove some of this linear gradient from the leaves of this vine maple, but those are already so bright, I don't think they're going to be affected by what we're about to do, which is to, for one, decrease our exposure just a tad, maybe 1/10 of a stop or close to it, and to drop our shadows. When we drop our shadows, when we drop our blacks, as you can see, we're not even doing very much, like -15 or so. It's really just over here on this right-hand side of the image that got darker. We're not affecting at all the leaves of the vine maple. We're really just affecting what's behind it. So that looks, in my eyes, really good. Maybe the only thing that we would have left, I said how I like that this area of the image is dark, but what I would like is a little bit more texture and detail to get the viewer's eyes started on this left to right journey through the image with this area right here. Human eyes go to areas that are brightest, and this area is dark, but it's important to the journey that you're about to take through this photo. So we're going to, again, just grab a brush. Sorry, you can probably hear my neighbor's dog barking outside. We're gonna brush this dark area right there. We don't need to do very much, and we don't want to hit any of those really bright areas. And as you've already seen, we're just gonna come in here, remove that brush from the rock. You'll notice my flow is still turned down, and that's because I want nice soft edges around the areas that I'm masking. That looks good. And let's see, what does this look like if we crank the exposure? That looks pretty good, right? That's a full stop higher than what I actually shot in the field. But now we're getting some really rich greens and just a lot more tonality coming out of that. Let's see what happens if we increase our shadows a little bit more. And if we drop our blacks, that looks good. We're getting some texture, so we'll come down here. Does it look good with some dehaze? Maybe, meh. Let's leave the dehaze off. But if we add some texture in here, there we go. Now we can really see that we have these tendrils of foam in the water that are showing up as lines. It's texture in something that is normally textureless. And looking at this image, we look pretty good. We don't really have any blown highlights except for maybe right here. As I said, you always want to keep an eye out when you're shooting long exposures of water. This is kind of what you need to worry about. So we're going to do just a tiny, tiny bit of a highlight reduction in this area. As I said, we're removing, masking out off of those rocks. This is not going to be a huge edit. We're just going to drop our highlights just a tad, maybe drop our exposure just a tad. I'm pretty happy with this image as it is right now, but there are two things that I try to do with every photo kind of towards the end of an edit. The first is to double check that I'm happy now that I've adjusted my vibrancy and my contrast. I want to make sure that I'm happy with my white balance, that it's not too crazy warm or cold. And I can tell you right now, this image looks a little bit warm. So I'm at 5300. I'm going to bring that down closer to 5000 or maybe 5100 or so. Sometimes it's easier just to type it in like that. And to me, that looks better. We've got a bit more blue tones coming into the water. But one thing I'm noticing is that a lot of my greens in this background are all kind of the same tone, and that's not helping the vine maple really pop. So to help that, what I'm going to do is come over to some of my VSCO presets, and I really like the look of the Kodak Max 800 Vibrant preset. Really, any of the 800s are good because it's a high ISO equivalent film preset, which means it's going to reduce contrast in the shadows, but still keep the image really moody, and that is exactly what I'm looking for here. So just looking around, if we look at the warm preset, that is way too much red, too much magenta, finding its way into our shadows. The Vibrant looks pretty good. It serves the broader mission of that vine maple really popping. And let's see, if we just go all the way back to like a basic 800, that looks good, but to me, it just doesn't quite have the same mood that I want this image to have. So I'm going to go with the Vibrant preset. I want the green vine maple to really stick out, and this preset gets me there from a color grading perspective. And I've already done 90% of the rest of the work. So right now, this image looks good. I don't think that we need to adjust our composition at all in terms of framing, maybe just a tad like that. Cropping it in so that way the vine maple is larger in the frame, as are these nice foreground rocks, but keeping some space between the top of that vine maple and the top of the frame. And it looks like to me, we've got a bit too much empty space over here on the left-hand side. So I'm going to scoot it over just a tad like that. Yeah. I think I'm pretty happy with that. We've got some really interesting elements in our foreground, these logs, these rocks. We've got the water leading us from left to right in the frame and leading us directly to this beautiful vine maple that is just bursting with bright color on the opposite shoreline of Falls Creek. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to export this image. We'll stick it in the video from last week, and let's move on to the next photo. So we've got one image in the bag. Let's move on to our second edit for this video. That is this photo right here. This is a handheld long exposure, and I say long exposure, it's about half a second, 0.4 seconds, f16, ISO 50, the lowest ISO I could get because I did not have an ND filter on my camera at this time. I only had a circular polarizer. The first thing that I want to highlight about this photo is what you should worry about, as I mentioned, anytime that you're shooting long exposures of water. And that is that you are bound to get really bright highlights down here where a waterfall hits a pool, or at the top of that waterfall, or really anywhere where you have a lot of bubbles in the water during a long exposure. So the very first thing that we're going to do for this waterfall is we're going to clean some of that up. We're going to just apply a brush to the entire lower cascade of the waterfall. There we go. We're going to, as you know, by now in the video, we're going to do an erase. You'll notice I have my flow turned down to about 75 or so. And all I'm trying to do is select the water itself, not just the highlighted areas, but the entire cascade, and none of the background, or as little of the background as we can get. And I'll actually zoom in right up here. There we go. Get rid of some of that. That looks pretty good. I do want to make sure, yeah, it looks like we've got good coverage up here in those kind of areas of concern, the top of the cascade and right down here. So if we zoom back out, we're going to do two things. We could drop our exposure, and maybe a little bit of that is warranted because this water is so bright. It's so aerated that there's so much light coming out of it. So we'll drop it by maybe about 0.2 of a stop. But what you really want to do with something like this, to just deal with those bright top and tail of the waterfall, is to just drop your highlights. That's not going to affect the rest of the cascade when those highlights don't exist, but we can be pretty aggressive and we can drop it maybe minus 20 or so, maybe even minus 25. Yeah, that looks pretty good. We may come in and clean that up a bit at the top, but to my eyes, that looks fine. And what we've done is we've actually almost equalized the exposure of this cascade with the cascade in the back, the upper cascade of Falls Creek Falls. This is a bit of a departure. Now that we're happy with kind of the exposure of the water, we've equalized the exposure of our subject to the exposure of the background for now. I'm going to go here and crop this image just a tad. First of all, I like the composition. I like the structure of having the back cascade offset. But in my view, we have a lot of empty space down here at the bottom of the image, and we have kind of these distracting elements right here and right here. So keeping my aspect ratio locked right over here, I'm just going to bring up this bottom, something like that. Maybe we'll shift it a little bit more left to right, so that way we feel like the waterfall has more space in the image as it journeys from left to right. And what I want to highlight is I'm not dragging it like that. That looks okay, but the waterfall itself, the base of the waterfall, is pressing right up against the frame of the image, and that just doesn't look good to my eyes compared to, for example, something like this, where we no longer have those distracting elements at the bottom of the image, but there's plenty of space for the waterfall to land into its pool and to kind of expand from there without leading your eyes directly to the edge of the frame. So at this point, things look pretty good. I think the color of the image could use a little bit of work. So we're going to go back over to our film presets, and maybe we'll just even look at max 800 vibrant again. Not quite. That's not quite where I want to be. Maybe a little bit more contrast. So if we go to like an ISO 200 film, kind of see where we're at with that. Well, that's way too much contrast right there, obviously. Maybe there could be something there. Maybe this could work. It's a little bit warm, but we can deal with that. So let's go with Kodak Gold 200. As I said before, I do not enjoy any kind of grain, so I'm going to remove the grain from this image. The very first thing that we're going to do is bring up our exposure, and we're going to bring our white balance. I don't actually want the warm of Kodak 200 warm. I just want that mood that it brings to the photo, that film would have brought if we had shot this image on film. So dropping my white balance just a tad. That looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. Our darks are real dark right now in this image, so we're going to work on those next. If we come over here to what that preset did to our image, you can see that the shadows are boosted, of course, the blacks are boosted, and then of course we have tone curves that are being done that really are adjusting the color of the image itself. But what we're going to do is correct some of that just a bit. We're going to bring our blacks and we're going to increase them just a tad. We're going to bring our shadows up just a tad. That preset added a bit too much drama, and we're going to come down here and actually remove a little bit of haze from the image. I want it to be dramatic, but I don't want it to be overly dramatic, right? We're going to clean up the bottom of this image a little bit with a linear gradient. And right now, if I do this linear gradient, as you can tell, I'm going to brighten the bottom of the image. It's also going to brighten the water, the cascade itself, and we don't want that. So by clicking up here on our linear gradient and going to subtract, we're going to actually tell it to subtract a luminance range. And then we are going to come over here and we're going to select our cascade. And the luminance range of that cascade is quite bright. So what you can see from the overlay is that we have removed the bright areas of our water from that linear gradient that we're applying. I'll go back to the linear gradient itself, and now we're going to brighten the bottom of this image so we can still get some detail, some of the rocks. We can see some of what's going on at the bottom of this waterfall, and we'll bring it up, a little bit less than half a stop. If we increase our shadows in the bottom, and as I mentioned before, bring your blacks a tad bit down anytime you do that. That looks pretty good. There's really no point in adjusting our whites. You can do that. It might make some of the rocks pop a bit more, but we just removed most of our whites from this particular linear gradient. And I will just increase the contrast a tad. That's looking a lot better. It's not just a black hole at the bottom of our image. This image is looking good. I think the color is pretty spot on to how I want it, to how I remember it, but there are two more things that I see that need fixing with this image. First is the trees. Up here around the top, these trees are, in my view, just a bit too hazy looking. There was a lot of mist in the air, and we can see that here, and that also takes away from the definition of the upper falls. And secondly, we still have just way too dark of blacks in this middle section here behind the falls. So we're going to use a brush and clean that up, and we're going to address those trees up at the top. Coming up here, we're going to create another brush. And as I mentioned before, I'm just going to brush this in maybe with a 65% flow or something like that, with conservative with the brush. Save ourselves too much cleanup. There we go. We'll add some down here. And again, we can color outside the lines a little bit because we are about to clean it up. That looks good. I'm going to drop my flow even more and just add a tad up here where we have some very obvious blacks that are a bit too dark. And we'll soften our edges by adding just a bit more over here. Go to erase, and again, auto mask, we can keep the flow a bit lower, and we're going to use it to soften the edges of what we just painted in. So you can see those strong edges, that's what we're looking to deal with right in there. And I'm going to turn that flow back up when it comes to removing the cascade itself. We don't want any of what we're about to do to affect the water. There you go. That looks pretty good. There's a little bit of a strong edge going on here, and you can actually see some of the mask got removed where it shouldn't have, right in here. This is why I don't use auto mask when I'm creating a mask. I only use it sometimes when I'm removing, and even then it can kind of get in the way, and that's because sometimes it does almost too good of a job. And you will end up with kind of this splotchy effect in the final image. So I'm going to go back right here, and I'm going to just paint in a bit more and fill these areas back in that the auto masking removed, because otherwise, as I mentioned, it would get real splotchy real quick in those areas. Okay, that looks okay. That edge along the right-hand side of the cascade may be a bit too strong, but the proof is in the pudding. So let's increase our exposure of the walls. That looks good. Increase our shadows just a tad. Yeah, we're getting all sorts of beautiful green mosses popping out of the background now. We'll drop our blacks just a tad, as you've seen me do 100 times. And now I'm going to also increase the whites and the highlights in these areas, because I want that moss to pop. That looks pretty darn good. We'll come down here and see what it looks like with some dehaze. Nope, don't really like that. But for sure, bringing some texture back into those shadows, since we were raising them quite a bit. And we'll increase the sharpness just of that back wall specifically. There we go. That looks pretty good to my eyes. The cascade itself is not necessarily the brightest thing in the image, which is what you often get in a lot of waterfall photos. Instead, it is in context. You can see the rocky, mossy cliffside that it's coming and cascading over. And let's go back to see the entire thing. As you remember, we had one more issue up here at the top where we want to come in and just make these trees a bit darker, a bit greener, and just a bit more definition up here at the top. Let's make sure right there. Crank our flow up, maybe 75. And start painting in up here. We don't want to go too much into this area. It already looks pretty good to my eyes. We're just trying to add a bit more definition and contrast to this back part of the image. That looks good. Come in here, clean things up just a tad towards these edges. We don't need this stump having any more definition. And certainly up here at the edge of our cascade, that can be left alone. These grasses can be left alone. There we go. That's looking pretty good right now. We're not going to drop our exposure here. I don't think that really serves the purpose of what I'm trying to do. Instead, we're going to drop our blacks. We're going to drop our shadows. We're going to leave our whites and our highlights as bright as they are. We can test cranking the contrast maybe a little bit. Yeah, something like that, like a +20. And I think this is a case where we're going to want to use the dehaze slider. So if I increase that a little bit, yeah, maybe a +10. Now the forest above these falls is much darker. It's a richer green than it was before, and we have a clearer definition of those upper cascades. Okay, so this image is pretty darn close to where we want it to be. It has nice contrast, the water isn't blown out, it's got really nice texture and detail in the water and in the cliff wall behind the waterfall, but I think it could use just a tad bit more focus in towards the center of the image, and that is what a vignette will get you. So I'm going to add just a very light vignette, like a -5, or -6 it looks like. And if you turn that vignette on and off, like I'm doing right now, you can see that it is doing exactly that. It's drawing your eye less towards the edges of the image and more towards the waterfall itself, more towards the middle of the image. Yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with that. So at this point, we've wrapped up our second image. We're going to go on to our third image, which I'll admit is the most challenging image of the entire trip. Okay, so our third image, I said it was a doozy. Here it is. What do you see that is wrong in this image? I see a few things that I like, and I see one major glaring issue that I really, really don't like. What I like about this image are the foreground elements. We have some really interesting dappled light hitting this log. We have other logs that are way too dark at the moment, but nonetheless add character to the scene. Of course, we have this beautiful cascade coming over these vibrant green mosses on the rocks. But the biggest problem in this image is that the right-hand side of this waterfall is in full sunlight. There's a huge imbalance in the exposure of this image, and we need to deal with that. Sometimes this happens. You know, I was out there in midday. It's just the way that the day planned out, and I was not going to leave this waterfall without a photo. And sometimes you just have to be able to deal with it in the edit, at least as best you can. So the way that we're going to deal with this is with a range mask, and we're specifically going to pick a luminance range. You're going to pick that, you're going to come over here, and you are going to select the bright areas of this image. That doesn't quite look right. It looks like maybe we also selected some shadows, so we'll pick a new area just to see, maybe down here in these grasses. There we go. That's looking a bit better. But of course, we're also getting all of our water in here. And the water, I think, is fine exposure-wise. So we're going to take this mask and we're going to subtract a linear gradient from it. And we're going to tell it to ignore anything that is to the left of this linear gradient. I want it to be pretty abrupt since we're working in confined spaces in here. There we go. That looks a bit better. The one issue I'm seeing here is that we are still affecting this log right here. I want that log to stay just how it is, so I edit it with the rest of the image. I don't want it to be affected by this exposure adjustment that we're about to do. So I'm going to make another subtraction with another linear gradient. You can also do a brush. I'm just moving quickly here, and I'm going to do a linear gradient right there. Maybe tilt it just a tad like that. So now what you see in the area, this kind of reddish overlay, is that we are only affecting, with the edits that we're about to make, this area on the right-hand side of the image, and more specifically, we are only affecting the bright areas of this side of the image. The dark shadows we have, we don't need to make them any darker, right? And of course, there are no highlights for us to affect in those areas. So if we come over here, we can bring our exposure down just a tad. And I'm not trying to get this to perfectly match the brightness or the exposure of the image on the left-hand side, because then it would look terrible. It would look like that, right? There's easily one or maybe even two stops of brightness difference here. But we're going to bring it down just a tad, maybe half a stop or a third of a stop. We're going to bring our highlights down, and we're going to bring our whites down. I'm pretty cautious affecting whites in an image, especially bringing them down, and highlights, because sometimes if you do it too much, you end up with gray tones in an image and it just doesn't look very good. The next thing that we're going to do is just deal with the exposure of the image as a whole. So I'm going to increase the exposure. I, again, underexpose when I'm shooting long exposures of water like this because I want to retain that highlight data in the water, especially here where we have a lot of aeration in the water. And it looks like, yeah, we're about almost 3/4 of a stop underexposed. We're going to take our highlights and we're going to bring them down, give ourselves a little bit more room in tonality. We're going to raise our shadows just a tad. Our whites also will bring down just a tad, and our blacks we're going to increase. We're not going to touch dehaze or clarity or anything like that. Our vibrance, I don't think this scene needs it. You could crank the vibrance, but look at what it does to your greens. They become just way too artificial looking. And even in this scene, if we apply a much more modest adjustment, like a +10, I would argue that still looks like way, way too green. Even more green than real life. And this was a very, very green cascade. So I'm going to actually leave the vibrance at 0, and I might actually desaturate things just a tad. And that will also help with those really bright greens that we have on the right-hand side of the image. Right here in our tone curve, we're going to bring our lights up just a bit, not too much, maybe a +13. We're going to experiment right now. If we bring our darks really far down, we definitely get a lot more contrast in the scene. That looks pretty good. But if we increase them, we're actually getting a bit more detail in our shadows. So I'm going to increase them, and then it's the shadows themselves that we'll experiment with and just see what a happy balance is here. I would say we're going to drop our shadows by about -15 or so. Scrolling down a little bit, again, we don't need to do denoising or anything like that. We're already shooting at pretty low ISOs. We already have just a default amount of sharpening. That's fine to leave in place. A vignette might be appropriate here. That will also help with that very bright area on the right-hand side. So if we do crank our vignette just to see what happens, obviously that's way too much at a -35. But if we bring it more to like a -10, maybe a -14, I'm going to say that's too much. We'll go back to like a -10. That's helping us darken these corners, focus the viewer's attention on the cascade itself more towards the center of the image. But it looks like our composition here might be ever so slightly off. There is a lot happening in this image, and so I'm going to give myself some space by removing a little bit of the top of that cascade. We don't need all of this extra woodland at the top of the image for you to get the clear message that this is a large, beautiful cascade with many streams working their way down. Now that I've removed that top area, since I'm maintaining my aspect ratio, that gives me a little bit of a choice. Do I keep it centered or do I scoot it left or right? And what you'll notice again about this image is that there's a flow of the water here from right to left, from the top of the image down to the right here, and then out and to the left. So I'm actually going to give that water even more room and push the image to the right, so that way you get a little bit more space on the left-hand side of the image. To me, this looks pretty good. We, of course, still need to deal with our water here. So take a guess as to what I'm about to do. You made it this far in the video, so you probably guessed that we are about to do another luminosity mask. It is one of the most powerful tools, along with the color range mask in Lightroom, so you should really learn how to use it. But this time, we are going to use the luminosity mask on the water, on the cascade itself. You could take a brush and go through and brush all of that water out of this image, but man, is that going to take you a very, very long time to accurately brush. Instead, if we select luminosity range for the water, we're going to do the exact opposite of what we did earlier. We're going to come over here and we are going to subtract, and in this case, we can even subtract a color range, and we're going to tell it that I want you to subtract all the greens from this mask. And it might actually be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but if we zoom in over here, what you can see is that these greens are no longer part of the masked area, but the water right next to it is. And that is exactly what we want. And now we could adjust our exposure of just the cascade itself. It's always good to swing it really to the extremes and see what that might get you. I tend to lower the exposure of water in long exposures because that tends to bring in a little bit more texture. So I'm going to drop the water by about 1/10 of a stop. We're going to bring down our highlights just a tad. Actually, I don't think we need to. Yeah, I don't think we need to. We're going to increase our shadows in the water for those really dark areas. We'll increase our whites just a tad. And for the edges, we're going to decrease our darks just a tad. So that way, where we do have those bright areas coming up against dark areas in the photo, it's going to add a little bit more definition. That's going to really help these thinner cascades out here in the middle of the waterfall pop a bit more. I'm going to come down here to texture, clarity, and dehaze. Dehazing this waterfall is not going to do us really any favors here. There's no haze to deal with, but the clarity slider can be really helpful, and I'm going to add in some texture. I always want texture in the water in a long exposure. At least in this case, I'm not going for that ethereal cloud look. I want movement in the water. The last thing that we're going to do to the bright areas of this cascade is adjust their white balance. Now, you might be wondering why you would adjust the white balance on just one part of the image, and this is really specific to waterfall photography. Right now, this water is kind of a middle gray, and it looks fine, but it doesn't really get across the message that this water is frigid cold, right? This is snowmelt coming down from the mountains. So if we just drop our white balance just a tad, that's even maybe too much. What you will see happening, I'll exaggerate the effect here, is that that water is coming out much bluer, while the rest of the image is actually quite warm in terms of white balance. That allows us to communicate that the temperature of this water is actually quite cold. So I'm going to back that off and go to maybe a -20. Yeah, that looks pretty good. That just buys us a little bit of blue over towards the edges of these very bright areas. You might notice right here that we still have a very bright area here. So I'm just going to quickly paint in maybe a little bit here too, actually. And we're going to do a quick erase on these darker areas and on the log. That looks pretty good. And we're just going to drop those highlights. There we go. We've got a really nice even exposure across these bright areas where the water has a lot of bubbles in it, and the waterfall as a whole, the cascade, looks really good. The only other thing that I think this image needs is maybe a white balance adjustment to all the greens that we have, or an adjustment of the hue of those greens, which we'll do in just a minute. But before then, I can see that down here at the base of the image, there's actually some really great detail in this pool that we are not taking advantage of. So I'm just masking out that area, cleaning up my mask, as you've seen me do 10 times in this video by now. And I'm going to crank the exposure down here just a tad, maybe half a stop. We're going to bring our shadows up. And what am I going to do? Yeah, we're going to drop our blacks just a tad. And you'll see how that brings some really nice contrast back to those areas that we erased. That looks much better to my eyes. Maybe a little bit of a clarity adjustment down here, since we did just raise the shadows a bunch, and a little bit of texture to really help the viewer see that, yes, there's interesting mosses and stones underneath the water in this part of the image. And that looks pretty good. As I said, there's one last thing to do, which is to maybe adjust the color in this image as a whole. We are going to do a color range mask. Just like how you would select a luminosity range, you drag and you can select a color range. I'm just going to pick these greens over here, being careful not to get very much of the dark shadows. That looks okay. We don't want any of our blues or anything like that. So I'm going to come in and I'm actually going to subtract the color range just in case of these blues down here. There we go. Clean things up just a tad. That's looking pretty good. And we might actually also subtract from this mask one more color range, which is some of these reds that are in this log. There we go. That looks a lot better. You can see that we are not affecting our foreground elements. Like, this log is going to remain mostly untouched. Maybe some greens in the shadows might be affected by what we're about to do. But really what we're working with here, if I turn the overlay on and off, is we are really just affecting these greens and the areas of shadow around those greens. All we're going to do is just bring the temperature, the white balance temperature of this image down. I want this to feel a little bit cooler, like we are down in the understory of the forest, because that's where I was. So we just drop our temperature just a tad, maybe a -15. And that just changed the entire image, right? If I come over here and I turn this off, we are in a summer day with that white balance adjustment turned off, turn it back on, and now everything is cooler. You can almost feel how cold that water is and how cold the mist coming off of it is in the air. Now that we've edited it, I'm pretty happy with this photo as a whole. I think it looks pretty good. But if I'm going to be honest with you, there is one thing that I would do differently that bugs me a little bit about this photo. And that is this tree right here. It is blurry. The leaves on this tree, on this vine maple, which I love so much, as you can tell from earlier photos, those leaves are blurry. And where they could have added even more texture to this scene, they don't. Instead, they just kind of make a mess of things. And the way that I should have photographed this would have been to expose for the water, get the whole scene nice and correct, make sure that I'm underexposing in those bright areas of highlight in the water. I should have taken that photo, and then I should have upped my ISO, increased my shutter speed from 1/4 or from 0.4 seconds to maybe something like 1/150th of a second. And I should have taken a second photo specifically for this tree and then composited those images together. To me, that's a perfectly acceptable edit to do. I'm not adding anything to the scene that wasn't there. I'm just making the details that my eyes were resolving apparent to the viewer of the photo. But I didn't do that. I'm going to keep that in mind next time I go back to a waterfall like Panther Creek Falls, and you should as well. And hopefully that's kind of a helpful tip for you in the future. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm really happy with these 3 images and with all the images that I got during this trip. To me, they evoke memories of standing outside of these waterfalls, of feeling the mist on my face, and that is exactly why I do this. I think it's why you do photography too, if I had to guess, is to bring you back to those places and to those moments and the people that you were with in those moments. I can forgive myself for the blurry bush in this last photo. I hope you can forgive me as well. And frankly, I would love your feedback, not just on the images themselves as a photographer to another photographer, but also on this video. Should I be more detailed in the future, less detailed? Should I speak faster or should I speak slower? You let me know and I will take that into consideration. And genuinely, if you like these videos, please like the video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so that way you know when the next video comes out. Otherwise, I'm going to export these images. I'm going to get them into last week's YouTube video so I can publish that one for your viewing enjoyment, and I will see you next time.